Hello and welcome from me, Philip Nothard and Curtis Hutchinson on this special Motor Trade Radio podcast brought to you in association with eBay Motors Group. Many thanks for joining us for this in the 8th in our series of special interviews themed around sharing the best practices as our car retailers manage their way through the COVID-19 crisis. Previous interviews you'll be aware of from Sittner's Group's Darren Edwards, Virtue Motors Robert Forrester, the IMDA's Yuma Samani, recently with Volvo UK MD Christian Elverforce, and last week's chat with KPMG's Lee Swinard are all still available to stream on the motortraderadio.com, on Spotify and Apple and Google Podcasts.
So we're delighted to welcome our special guest today, Andy Shields, who is the Global Business Unit Director at INDICATA. So welcome to the podcast, Andy, and perhaps you could start by giving listeners just a brief overview of what INDICATA actually does.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me on. INDICATA, basically we operate in 13 European countries at the moment, including the UK all the way through to Turkey. What we do is every day we analyse the internet for all the used car adverts that are out there, and we pull down about 9 million adverts every single day. We bring all that data into our data set, and then we go through and using various techniques of AI, looking at the photography to make sure that the cars are correctly described with AI, etc. We then produce a whole data set of movement of pricing, of movement of sales, of incoming vehicles into the whole motor trade space from a retail perspective. And we take all that data and then we feed it back, and we in a series of reports and tools for the use of car dealers, for the use of leasing companies, rental companies, OEM reporting, so OEMs can track their dealer activity. So a range of different things, all related to used car pricing and used car volumes.
I mean, welcome, Andy. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. I mean, we've kind of known each other for many years across the industry through your background and my background, and I'm sure we've crossed paths numerous times through that. But it's great to have you on eventually. So, in terms of INDICATA, you started producing a series of market watch papers themed around COVID-19 and the more recent one of signs of recovery. Can you talk us through some of the key findings and what learnings there are for the UK dealers, maybe some learnings from what you've seen in the European market?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we started when COVID-19 initially hit with a white paper, which was a strategic document to really identify how we saw COVID-19 going forward, or at least a range of options on how we saw COVID-19 going forward and impacting the European used car industry. From that, we did a lot of analysis, and then subsequently, every 10 days, we produce this Market Watch report, which looks at, for the 13 European countries that we cover, both pricing and also volumes. And within that, it's been absolutely fascinating to then track initially as each country went into lockdown, the timing of that lockdown, the severity of that lockdown, and now as we're going forward to have a look at how countries are coming out, and Austria and Germany, the kind of the first two countries that are coming out. So we've got some really interesting information in and around how they're coming out. Overall, I think if I give a sign of what the data tells us is, firstly, in terms of it depends on the scale of the lockdown equals the impact into the marketplace. So if we take countries like Sweden, where and everybody talks about Sweden as being a very light lockdown country, they went into basically a drop of about only 20% of their used car volumes. And have subsequently now recovered back up to 100% position. Whereas if we obviously take Italy, we take Spain, we take France, we take the UK, they went in very, very hard. But there's also that midpoint of countries like Denmark, countries like Netherlands, who have got an intermediate level of lockdown, and they went to about 60% of their natural volumes over the period. And the interesting thing is those countries are also beginning now to do a level of recovery, even though they haven't changed their lockdown rules.
Now, you've mentioned Austria and Germany there, Andy. Now, they're the first European markets to reopen their showrooms. They reopened last month. Yeah. And both markets appear to bounce back really quickly. But how indicative do you think these trends are for other markets? Was there anything that actually stood out with Austria and Germany and differentiates them?
I think, yeah. So if I look at those two markets, Austria first, they released their lockdown rules, and dealers with less than a 400 square metre showroom, so 20 metres by 20 metres, were allowed to start trading as from the 14th of April. From Germany, it was from the 20th of April that all dealers were allowed to open and begin trading. Austria, 1st of May, they just started. So what's been interesting, if I look at Austria, where it's only a partial set of dealers, they've from the 14th to the end of April, they have now got to about 80% of their pre-lockdown run rate overall. Whereas in Germany, where all dealers opened, even though it's a shorter period of time from the 20th, their run rate is now up to about 90% of their pre-lockdown levels, and there or thereabouts. On the sort of 90%, 86% of prior year sort of level. So what it has been for me really surprising. I've probably been one of the more bearish commentators on the industry, and to see these two markets bounce back as quick as they have done has actually, I'll be honest, has been a surprise. I think the thing we then got to have a look at is, will that get replicated across other European countries, and will it get replicated across the UK? And I think the first thing is, if you look at those two countries, they managed their infection really well. So there's significantly less deaths per million, significantly less cases per million compared to the UK, compared to France and Italy, Spain. And equally, they are countries with relatively strong GDPs per capita. And so they're very affluent countries overall. So I sense there is an element of these countries having gone in, had a kind of a short, sharpish shock, and have come out, and the consumer is quite confident, and the economy, people haven't realised whether has it actually hit the economy or not. And so you're seeing this relatively fast bounce back. The real question is going to be, do we see that same level of bounce back coming from definitely the southern Europeans, where Spain, Italy really have taken a battering, both economically and psychologically for the consumer, and dependent on what happens and what Boris does in terms of us bringing us out, and how fast the impact of the consumer in the UK. I think people won't bounce back quite as fast and as quick as Germany and Austria, but it's really surprised me the speed that they've moved.
So in terms, I've had the pleasure of obviously seeing some of your data on the recent VRA webinar that you joined, but you talk about obviously the research and data from across the 13 markets. Mm-hmm. What other sales and pricing trends are you seeing through the COVID-19 lockdown?
So in terms of the overall trends, if I take kind of at a very high level, the markets that have been open for a period of time. So I talked about Sweden before. There the dealers have had time to react. So the market's been down. There has been pressures on the market anyway, and you've seen pricing drop from the 1st of February to the beginning of May by about 4.4%. So those markets that market's dropped down quite significantly. If I then look at countries like the UK, like France, like Italy, frankly, they haven't moved. Why? Because they've been in lockdown. So the dealers haven't been coming in. There's been a few movements in price, but statistically it's nothing. It doesn't make any difference. And the UK itself is kind of actually 0.4 up since the 1st of May, which is just nothing. It's statistically not relevant. You then got that midpoint position where you've got countries like Denmark who have been open, they've been trading. They've sort of moved about 2%, that middle ground element. Overall, if I then look at kind of pricing in Germany, has been the one that we've kind of done a bit of a more detailed dive down. And it's interesting to see that their pricing, whilst is kind of overall is about 1.7% down, you get quite a significant difference between different categories of car. So the mini segment, the small vehicle segment are all about 1% down, whereas you move into luxury cars and they're about 2.5%, 3% down. So there is a very much a focus in terms of the bigger the car, the harder it is falling. And that kind of replicates the sort of residual value trends that we all saw in the 08-09 recession, where you had this kind of large cars really taking a bit of a battering. One thing that's interesting about Germany is the way that the sports car sector has bounced back and is significantly up. So it's about 30% up on its pre-lockdown levels, and is about 20% up year on year. So actually, there's growth now in the sports car segment, and that's been great. There's still been about a 1% drop in pricing of the sports car segment, but it's just a sign of people coming out of lockdown. In the last recession, when people came out of the last recession, they did have a tendency of having a treat car, and I must go and buy myself something nice. 4x4s and sports cars were relatively cheap because they'd taken a battering. But there is definitely a sign of customers coming out saying, I'll treat myself, I'll buy something nice. And that same trend we see in Austria as well.
That's an interesting point there about sports cars and the appeal in Germany. Has the crisis actually impacted what type of used cars are in strong demand, and maybe also the different fuel types? How are they faring as well?
Oh, absolutely. I think probably the biggest trend is, and people have kind of talked about it in terms of, is this happening going to make the consumer even more environmental? This whole concept of the human race is fairly fragile, our planet is fairly fragile, and it's really been brought home by COVID that actually, we've got to start looking after the whole environment much better. And so what we are seeing is a really significant acceleration in the swap from diesel into petrol and into hybrid. So you see Poland probably had the biggest swap. There's been a swing of about 9% of vehicles out of diesel into petrol. Germany about 6% swing. And that's just over a 2-month period. So that's pre-lockdown, post-lockdown numbers for Germany. And again, we're seeing a level of swing into hybrid, where, if you take Sweden, hybrid and electric vehicles are both 33% up from the kind of February period up to the current period. So a real strengthening of the kind of environmental view of life, which bodes well for petrols and doesn't bode well for diesel residuals.
So the swing away from diesel that we were seeing has actually accelerated as a result of the various lockdowns.
Yeah, as people have come out of lockdown, and with the data we've looked at, we've looked primarily not at the whole of Europe, but the exiting lockdown countries, and that's where the biggest, those swings are just remarkable. Just for a 2-month period, to see kind of a 6% swing in Germany in a 2-month period is just wow.
And finally, I mean, there's are there any sort of used car trends for here in the UK market that we can learn from obviously what you're seeing for dealers as we come out of lockdown? We know that there's obviously talks around the consumer behaviours towards public transport and the perception that they may start to move back to ownership of vehicles, and there's a view obviously in the type of pricing points of which consumers will move into, those that haven't necessarily got a car today that may look to purchase one as a consequence of caution around public transport. Have you got any trends that you can share that you've learned from across the European market that you've been looking at?
I think that's interesting. The answer in that is at the moment not necessarily, and I'll explain why. I had a fascinating conversation with a dealer in Poland this week, who basically said to me, look, what's happening at the moment, and Poland is theoretically a lockdown market still, but there's a lot of a bit of online, and there's a lot of kind of side trading that shouldn't be going on. So it's running about 40-50% of its previous levels. And he was convincing me that actually that there was a lot of people coming out and historically didn't have a car, not wanting to use public transport, deciding to buy a car, and therefore the market currently in kind of small, older used cars was going to be booming, and it was going to be great. And I looked at that data and went, oh, actually, no, there isn't any. The market is lifting, but it's lifting equally between smaller cars and larger cars, older cars and younger cars. So from that perspective, I was actually surprised that this great theory of a trend wasn't necessarily being reflected. I will say that we're still in very, very, very early stages. So we're going to be looking out for those trends and trying to understand, are they going to happen from that point? The diesel petrol one is definitely there. But the smaller cars versus large cars, older cars versus new cars theory that we had in Poland, don't see it at this stage in that level of detail.
So, Andy, many thanks for joining us today and sharing your views on used car sales and pricing trends across Europe and what the implications could be for dealers here in the UK. I know retailers listening to this will find this very useful as they prepare to open their businesses after lockdown is eased or lifted. So many thanks for coming on.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me on the programme.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. It's been an absolute pleasure, and it's get to see the market watch reports that you're putting out. So we'll obviously keep in touch and potentially get you back on at some point in the future as we start to see what the market looks like on post lockdown, I suppose, at some point, whenever that is.
Be delighted.
Okay, so that's all for now. Many thanks again to Andy for joining us. You've been listening to this special Motor Trade Radio podcast brought to you in association with eBay Motors Group. Please like and share on social media, as it's so important during these times for the dealer community to work together and share experiences and best practices. Many thanks to you for listening and supporting the podcast. Philip and I will be back with the industry headlines on Saturday, but do watch out for more special podcast interviews as we work through this crisis. Until then, do stay safe and stay well.